Alright, hello, I am John Kelly,
I'm Stephen Gordon.
and this is the Encounter commentary on issue 12, The Attack of the Mechagoblin for 2C Gaming's 2CGazette. Thanks for joining us. So, today, Steve and I are going to talk through an upcoming encounter for the 2CGazette, The Attack of the Mechagoblin, which is an encounter level 5 challenge, which is going to come out in early August. And basically the purpose of our conversation here is we're just going to talk through kind of some of the details of the encounter and ask Steve some questions about design. So, right off the bat, Steve, can you kind of give an overview of what this encounter is going to be about?
Yeah, definitely. The Attack of the Mechagoblin encounter centers around, as you might have guessed, the Mechagoblin, which is just a big, ramshackle goblin construct. It's got all of these absurd weapons. It has a goblin catapult to launch minions around the battlefield. And basically this thing just kind of shows up, and it's up to the players to react to this absurd but also dangerous situation that they suddenly find themselves in.
Yeah, and the way that it's presented is, just what you said. It stomps out of the trees and walks up to the players, and that's kind of some of the fun of design of this type of encounter, right? You don't really have to come up with a backstory. You kind of leave that up to the DM.
Right.
So, go ahead.
And one of my goals was to make something that can be used as a random encounter that also then can lead into story elements, because hopefully your players will then ask, like, where did this thing come from?
Right.
What is happening?
Right.
Instead of just the usual, we fought some goblins, everybody fights goblins on the road.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that sort of lends itself to the players, or encouraging the players to ask those types of questions, is just the absurdity with which this creature is presented, and the powers and description. It's described as having, pink and green coloration, just flashy and absurd, and I'm really excited to see what we're having Jason do the speed paint for this right now, so I'm really excited to see what he decides to do with this picture. I hope it's going to be crazy. So, Steve, can you speak to any of, I guess we'll just talk about the abilities, because, similar to the description of this thing and kind of how it presents itself, they're kind of wonky. So, maybe just high level go through them.
Yeah, so the Mechagoblin has 4 attacks, and I went through a bunch of different iterations for each of the abilities and kind of figuring out how I wanted this creature to play. We'll start with the Goblin Catapult, because I knew that I wanted this thing to have some goblins with it. And initially, the design was the goblins would jump off of the exterior of this thing and land next to it and run at the players. Every time it started its turn, more goblins would jump off. But I found that was a little bit tricky with initiative, and then I added the ability that when it gets reduced below half health, it starts venting steam, and so the goblins would be jumping into the steam. So I decided to go with the Goblin Catapult because it's hilarious.
Right.
And I've definitely seen that idea in fantasy before. I'm not sure exactly where at the moment, but there's something about goblins launching themselves out of catapults.
Yeah, it sounds familiar. It's like the halfling hurlers, right?
Right. It just makes sense.
Right.
Okay. And then the whisk ability was just totally out of left field. I was just thinking about what sort of attachments would go on this thing, and I had recently been in the kitchen, so I thought about a whisk, and then I said, what would a whisk do? What would a giant whisk do? Sure. And I figured, it would scoop somebody up and spin them around.
Yeah, I like that. Drawing inspiration from household objects to decide how your goblins are gonna do things.
Yeah. And then the elemental capacitor was basically just, it needed a ranged attack.
Sure.
And I wanted something that would play with the minions as well, so it lights up the target like fairy fire to give the minions advantage on their attacks. And that led into the ordered multi-attack, which you were asking about before this call.
Right.
Because with all of these different abilities, I didn't want the Dungeon Master to have to figure out which one do I use in what order. And they would want to use the Elemental Capacitor first because it might give them advantage on later attacks. So I just said the multi-attack happens in this order every time. And that kind of streamlines the encounter, and also I don't have to worry about the Mechagoblin having advantage on some rounds and potentially doing a lot more damage than it should.
Right. So the sort of thought that I had when I was looking that over is that it was almost intended not to, because, I mean, you're right, with 4 attacks, you're going to have a lot of options available to you, and splicing those in all kinds of different ways, could be hectic for the DM. When I looked at that, though, the thing that I was mostly thinking was, oh, this is, this feels like a construct. It feels like something that is predefined and doesn't really, it just kind of has this series that it goes through all the time. And I really liked the notion of running this encounter and essentially saying, well, there's no one nearby to whisk, but the thing still tries to whisk something.
Right.
It's just kind of whirring and spinning as it goes, which seemed interesting to me. But that makes a lot of sense to kind of streamline things and help the DM out here.
Yeah, and it makes it feel very goblinoid to just have this, it's time for the whisk to activate, so there it goes.
Right, yeah. And one of the other things that I kind of wanted to touch on here with you was in the design of this creature, because really this encounter focuses pretty heavily on this creature. There's some other components, like we bring in elements of minions from 4th edition that sort of then apply back to 5th edition, and we may touch on that a little bit more here, but we might save that for another call. And using weak creatures against strong foes and that type of thing. But one of the things that I was interested in looking through the stat block here was this sort of self-limiting, like elements of the Mechagoblin are, inherently at that sort of midpoint, like it has vulnerable components where people can get advantage on attacks against it, or similar when they deal, basically like when it fails saves, kind of like concentration. And then also the thing you mentioned before where it starts bending steam halfway through. And so one of the things I wanted to run by you and sort of get your thoughts on here was how do you go about designing a creature that you want to feel really powerful and then toning it back the appropriate amount to make sure that it's a viable challenge?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, giving it some weaknesses is one of my favorite design elements. Just from a simple standpoint, there was a low-level encounter we did for one of the TPK primers, where I think like a 3rd or 4th level party goes up against some, massive ogre, and the ogre has a magic allergy, so it has disadvantage on all saves against spells, which means that players can lock it down with magic super easily. And in my experience at the table, players love when they can exploit a creature's weakness. And I wanted the Mechagoblin to kind of have some of that feel to it, where like they see that when they hit it really hard, it's got to make a saving throw, and if it fails, it gets kind of janked up. So then they know, like, okay, yeah, we need to really smack this thing as hard as we can, and that I think is more satisfying than just making it like consistent. It gives kind of peaks and valleys to the encounter where it does some things that are really strong, and the players are thinking, oh, we're doomed, we're screwed, we don't have a chance. But then they have things they can do, which then tip the battle back in their favor.
Yeah, and one of the things, so I've seen this occasionally. This is kind of infrequently used, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's cool. But I've seen, just as a warning to the potential DMs who may be watching this and think, I'm absolutely going to do this. There's definitely the potential of making your weakness too significant or too specific, and so it's really important to put a lot of focus and emphasis into there. What would you say as far as advice for providing weaknesses to creatures that are too powerful? How would a DM kind of start on that, or get an idea of where to go? Because you don't want to show up and say, hey, this creature is vulnerable to paralysis. Anytime it's paralyzed, it fails saves automatically. Like, that's obviously going to be too significant.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky balance because the two things to consider, I would say, are the scope of the weakness, like what it's vulnerable to. If it's as broad as all physical damage, or as specific as, when this creature is deafened, it's all messed up.
Sure.
And then also the impact of the weakness, because being vulnerable to damage can be really significant, because that's it doubles all of the damage of that type that they take.
Right.
Whereas with the Mechagoblin, the impact is just it has disadvantage on attacks, which is a significant penalty, but it's not going to end the encounter.
Right.
Whereas in the example you were mentioning, where like if it's paralyzed, it fails all of its saves automatically. Like when the players figure that out,
Right.
they can just steamroll the whole encounter.
Yeah. And one of the things that I like is the option that you provided here. The Mechagoblin actually has some counterplay for it. It can essentially fairy fire a target to negate its disadvantage, which I think is very solid. So. Well, that's about it as far as time goes here. I'm looking forward to seeing the Mechagoblin kind of roll through player groups, and so hopefully you guys who are watching this have a good time playing through it, and you will be seeing the Mechagoblin in August. Not sure if it's going to be mid-August or end of August, but you will be seeing it in August, and it'll be a good time. All right, I think that's pretty much it.
All right.
So yeah, we're at 10 minutes and 45